Well, hello there, sleepy souls. Looks like you've wandered into another forgotten corner of history where breathing itself becomes an adventure. Tonight, we're diving into December 1952 when London decided to cosplay as a post apocalyptic nightmare for 5 straight days. You're about to experience what it was really like when an entire city disappeared into its own toxic breath. And spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't have made it through day 3 without some serious respiratory drama. Picture this: you're waking up on December 5th, 1952, in your modest London flat. The radiator's been acting up again, so you've been burning whatever coal you could afford, which, let's be honest, isn't the premium stuff. Outside your window, something's different. There's fog, sure, but this isn't your typical British pea souper. This is fog with attitude fog, with a grudge against visibility itself. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm always curious about who's choosing historical suffocation as their bedtime story. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pull back your curtains and immediately notice something unsettling. The fog outside isn't the usual wispy romantic London mist that poets write about. This fog has substance weight presence. It's pressing against your window like it's trying to get inside, and frankly, it's winning. The morning light, what little manages to penetrate this atmospheric soup, has taken on an eerie yellowish tinge that makes everything look like an old sepia photograph come to life. Your neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, is already up. You can hear her coughing through the thin walls. She's been coughing more lately, actually, but then again, everyone has. It's December in London after all, and the cold has been particularly bitter this year. You've all been burning more coal than usual, and the cheaper stuff tends to leave everyone a bit wheezy. Still, there's something about this morning's fog that feels different, more ominous. As you dress for work, you notice the fog seems to be thickening rather than lifting. Usually, morning fog burns off as the sun climbs higher, but this particular atmospheric phenomenon appears to be getting stronger, more dense, more determined to stay put. Through your window, you can barely make out the building across the street, a structure you've looked at every morning for the past 3 years suddenly looks like a ghost ship emerging from some nautical nightmare. The air itself seems heavier today, carrying scents that don't belong in December morning fog. There's the usual coal smoke, of course, but underneath that familiar London aroma lurks something else, something that makes your nose wrinkle and your throat feel scratchy. It's a metallic taste that coats your tongue, a sulfurous hint that reminds you uncomfortably of rotten eggs left too long in the pantry. You decide to venture outside to assess the situation properly. The moment you open your front door, the fog doesn't just greet you, it embraces you, wraps around you like an unwelcome relative who holds hugs too long. Visibility drops to maybe 10 feet, possibly less. Street lamps that should have been turned off hours ago are still glowing weakly through the murk, their light barely penetrating this atmospheric wall. Your usual morning walk to the bus stop becomes an exercise in faith-based navigation. You know these streets like the back of your hand, yet suddenly every familiar landmark has vanished into the gray-green void. The post box on the corner, gone. The baker's shop with its cheerful red awning swallowed whole. Even the sounds of the city seem muffled, as if the fog is absorbing not just light, but audio itself. This isn't just fog, this is London's atmosphere turning against its own inhabitants, and you're about to spend the next 5 days learning exactly what happens when a city of 8 million people suddenly can't see their own feet. You're standing in what feels like the world's most toxic snow globe, and the person responsible for shaking it is a perfect storm of industrial arrogance and meteorological malice. This isn't just bad weather, this is decades of progress finally coming home to roost in your lungs. Every breath you take is a cocktail mixed by coal-burning power stations, domestic fireplaces, and Mother Nature's particularly twisted sense of timing. The fog wrapping around you like a suffocating scarf is actually a masterpiece of environmental destruction years in the making. London in 1952 runs almost entirely on coal, the black gold that built the British Empire, and is now trying to bury it under a blanket of toxic soup. Every power station within city limits is belching out smoke like a dragon with a serious attitude problem, and there are dozens of them scattered throughout the metropolitan area. But here's where it gets interesting. You're not just dealing with industrial pollution, you're also contributing to this atmospheric nightmare every time you shovel coal into your own fireplace. The winter of 1952 has been particularly brutal, and everyone's been burning whatever fuel they can afford. Post-war rationing might be over, but quality coal still costs more than most people can manage, so you're all burning the cheap stuff, low-grade coal that's about as clean as a chimney sweep's handkerchief. This inferior coal doesn't burn cleanly. Instead of producing nice hot flames that consume most of their own byproducts, your domestic fires are creating enormous amounts of particulate matter, sulfur compounds, and carbon monoxide. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of homes across London, and you've got a recipe for respiratory disaster that would make a Victorian-era factory owner blush with pride. Now here's where meteorology decides to join the party uninvited. December 5th brings with it a weather phenomenon called a temperature inversion, basically nature's way of putting a lid on a pot of toxic soup. Normally, warm air rises and carries pollution up into the atmosphere where it can disperse harmlessly. But today, a high-pressure system has settled over London like a giant atmospheric paperweight, trapping all that lovely pollution right at street level where you get to breathe it. The science is actually quite elegant in its cruelty. Cold, dense air sits at ground level while warmer air hovers above it, creating an invisible ceiling that prevents any vertical mixing. All those chimneys and smokestacks that usually send their emissions skyward today, they're just pumping poison directly into your breathing space. It's like someone decided to turn London into the world's largest gas chamber, except everyone's still trying to go about their daily business. Historians still argue whether the authorities could have predicted this particular combination of factors, but honestly, it probably wouldn't have mattered. Environmental protection in 1952 is about as sophisticated as a stone axe, and the idea that industrial progress might actually kill people is still considered somewhat radical thinking. The fog you're breathing contains a delightful mix of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and countless tiny particles of soot and ash. Each breath is like smoking several cigarettes simultaneously, except cigarettes at least have filters. Your lungs are essentially being asked to process the exhaust from an entire industrial civilization, and they're about as prepared for this task as a goldfish is for mountain climbing. What makes this particularly insidious is how gradual the buildup feels. This morning's fog seemed merely thick. By afternoon, it's becoming genuinely dangerous. The concentration of pollutants is increasing exponentially, but your eyes and nose are adjusting to the gradual change. It's like slowly boiling a frog, except the frog is 8 million Londoners, and the pot is their entire city. The industrial areas are particularly hellish. If you're unlucky enough to live near the Thames, where many of the power stations cluster like mechanical vultures, the air has taken on an almost solid quality. The fog here isn't just yellowish, it's actively green in places, and it stinks like a combination of rotten eggs and burnt rubber. This is where the real heavy lifting of pollution creation happens, and the residents are getting the full benefit of London's commitment to coal-powered progress. Meanwhile, the domestic contribution keeps building. Every chimney in every neighborhood continues pumping out its share of toxins. The irony is beautiful. In its deadly simplicity, people are burning more coal to stay warm, which creates more pollution, which traps more heat at ground level, which makes the fog denser, which makes people light more fires to combat the unnaturally dark, cold feeling the fog creates. You're witnessing the birth of a feedback loop that would make a climate scientist weep with professional admiration and personal horror. By mid-morning, you realize London hasn't just acquired some dramatic weather, it's undergone a complete personality transplant. The city you've known all your life is vanishing piece by piece, replaced by something that belongs more in a gothic horror novel than in suburban Britain. Streets you could navigate blindfolded are now alien landscapes where familiar becomes frightening with each passing hour. You attempt your usual route to work, but the fog has other plans for your morning commute. What started as merely thick has evolved into something approaching solid. The visibility that was 10 feet an hour ago has shrunk to maybe 3 feet, then 2, and by the time you reach what should be the main road, you can barely see your own outstretched hand. It's like someone draped the entire city in wet wool and then decided that wasn't suffocating enough. The transformation isn't just visual, it's sensory overload of the worst kind. The fog carries sounds differently now, muffling some noises while amplifying others in ways that make no logical sense. Footsteps seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. Car engines sound like they're underwater, their headlights creating pathetic little bubbles of yellow light that illuminate exactly nothing useful. You hear voices calling out people trying to locate each other, but the fog swallows their words and spits them back distorted and directionless. Street lamps are burning during what should be broad daylight, their light barely penetrating beyond their own glass housings. These beacons that normally guide nighttime wanderers have become useless decorations, glowing feebly like dying stars in this manufactured twilight. Even the sun has given up. Somewhere above this toxic blanket, it's probably shining beautifully, but down here in the fog zone, you might as well be living in a coal mine. The strangest part is how the fog seems to have personality quirks. In some streets, it swirls and moves like it's alive, creating brief windows of slightly better visibility before closing them again like some atmospheric practical joke. In other areas, It sits absolutely still, creating walls of impenetrable gray-green that feel solid enough to lean against. You start to understand why medieval people believed in malevolent spirits. This fog genuinely feels intentional, deliberate, like it's actively working against human movement, building facades that you've passed thousands of times now, loom out of the murk like ghost ships materializing from supernatural seas. Your local pub, where you've spent countless evenings, appears suddenly from the fog, looking like something from a Victorian ghost story. Even familiar shop signs become ominous when they emerge unexpectedly from the gloom, their cheerful colors muted into threatening shadows. The fog has also acquired some disturbing aesthetic qualities that no respectable British weather should possess. In certain areas, particularly near the industrial zones, it's developed distinct color variations. Patches of yellow mix with areas of green, while other sections maintain a more traditional gray, but with an oily, iridescent quality that makes you think of polluted rainbows. It's beautiful in the same way that a toxic waste dump can be beautiful, impressive, but definitely not something you want to get too close to. People are starting to adapt their behavior in ways that would seem comical if they weren't so necessary. You see businessmen holding on to iron railings like mountaineers working their way along cliff faces. Mothers are tying rope around their children's waists before venturing out, treating a simple trip to the shops like an Arctic expedition. Everyone moves slowly, cautiously, hands extended like amateur zombies, feeling their way through an obstacle course designed by someone with a particularly cruel imagination. The fog's thickness varies unpredictably from block to block, creating a bizarre geography of visibility. One street might offer maybe 5 feet of sight, while the next reduces your world to arm's length. It's like walking through invisible rooms with different atmospheric densities, each one a surprise package of respiratory irritation. Your eyes water constantly now, not from emotion, but from the chemical assault of breathing what used to be called air. Historians still argue whether this uneven distribution was due to local wind patterns or differences in pollution sources, but standing here in the middle of it, you're less concerned with meteorological theory than with basic navigation. The fog has turned your familiar neighborhood into a maze where every wrong turn could lead you completely astray, and every landmark you've relied on has been erased by this atmospheric vandalism. What's truly unsettling is how the fog seems to absorb not just light and sound, but hope itself. The cheerful bustle of London life is being systematically strangled by this toxic blanket, replaced by an eerie quiet, broken only by confused voices, tentative footsteps, and the occasional crash of someone walking into something they couldn't see coming. Welcome to London's newest extreme sport, attempting to move from point A to point B without disappearing into the atmospheric abyss. Every journey, no matter how short, has become a tactical operation requiring the planning skills of a military strategist and the faith of a religious zealot. You're about to discover that walking 3 blocks to buy milk can feel like crossing the Sahara blindfolded while being chased by invisible predators. Your morning attempt to reach the bus stop becomes an exercise in creative navigation that would impress a medieval explorer. The sidewalk you've walked thousands of times is now a treacherous path where every step could lead to disaster. Lampposts materialize from the fog like iron trees in some dystopian forest, and you find yourself grabbing onto them gratefully, using them as waypoints in your slow motion odyssey through London's new toxic geography. The fog has transformed ordinary street furniture into navigation aids. Mailboxes become precious landmarks, their red paint barely visible, but still offering confirmation that you haven't wandered into some parallel dimension where London doesn't exist. Garden gates and hedges turn into handrails that you follow with the desperate concentration of a tightrope walker, your fingers trailing along cold metal and wet foliage as you feel your way through what used to be your neighborhood. Other pedestrians emerge from the murk, like ghosts with solid footsteps, appearing suddenly within arm's reach before disappearing again into the gray-green void. Everyone moves with the same cautious shuffle arms, extended, testing each step like they're walking on ice that might crack at any moment. Conversations happen between invisible people, voices floating disembodied through the fog, as strangers help strangers navigate the impossible maze their city has become. You start developing fog walking techniques that would look ridiculous in normal weather, but feel brilliant in these conditions. Shuffling your feet helps you detect curbs and obstacles before they trip you. Extending one arm forward while keeping the other ready to grab railings becomes your standard posture. You learn to listen for the sound of footsteps on different surfaces, the hollow echo of steps on pavement versus the softer thud on grass tells you whether you're still on the sidewalk or have wandered into someone's garden. The fog plays optical tricks that would be fascinating if they weren't so dangerous. Objects appear larger and closer than they actually are, then shrink and recede as you approach them. That building you thought was right in front of you turns out to be 20 feet away, while the parked car you assumed was distant nearly takes your knee out as you walk into its bumper. Distance becomes meaningless when visibility fluctuates between 0 and 3 feet, depending on mysterious atmospheric whims. Street signs, when you can find them, become precious treasures worth memorizing. You find yourself reading them aloud, partly to confirm your location, and partly because hearing your own voice provides some comfort in this disorienting environment. Regent Street. You announce to the fog as if it cares about your progress report. The fog doesn't respond, but it does manage to make the sign disappear again within seconds of your reading it. Navigation by sound becomes crucial, but the fog distorts audio in ways that would confuse a bat. Car engines seem to come from everywhere, and nowhere their Doppler effects scrambled by the dense air. You hear footsteps that could be 10 feet away, or 50 voices that sound close, but belong to people you never managed to locate. The acoustic landscape has become as unreliable as the visual one, turning your ears into instruments that provide data, but not necessarily useful information. Public spaces you've known for years become alien territories. The park where you sometimes eat lunch has transformed into something resembling the surface of an unexplored planet. Trees emerge from the fog like massive silent creatures, their branches appearing suddenly at head level with a startling intimacy that makes you duck and weave, like you're being attacked by very slow, very large spiders. Even indoor destinations become challenging when you can't find their entrances. Shops you visit regularly seem to have vanished entirely, their familiar facades erased by the fog until you're literally touching their windows before you realize you've found them. Door handles become more valuable than gold, representing not just entry to buildings, but proof that civilization still exists somewhere behind this atmospheric curtain. The fog has also created a peculiar democracy of disorientation. Rich and poor, young and old, everyone moves with the same tentative uncertainty. Class distinctions disappear when everyone is equally blind, equally lost, equally dependent on luck and persistence to reach their destinations. Historians still argue whether this temporary social leveling had any lasting impact on British society, but right now, you're too busy trying not to walk into a lamppost to worry about sociological implications. You begin to understand why ancient peoples created myths about fog spirits and atmospheric demons. This isn't just weather, it's an active opponent, something that seems to deliberately confuse and mislead you, hiding familiar landmarks and revealing them again just when you've given up hope of ever seeing them. Transportation in London has officially declared bankruptcy. Not the financial kind, the physical, logistical, we literally cannot function anymore kind. Every wheel wing and rail system that keeps 8 million people moving through their daily lives has met its match in this atmospheric monster, and frankly, the fog is winning by a landslide. You're watching the circulatory system of one of the world's great cities suffer the complete cardiac arrest. The buses, those iconic red double-deckers that usually lumber through London traffic with the confidence of mechanical elephants, have become pathetic metal sculptures scattered helplessly throughout the city. Bus drivers, those heroes of the urban working class, have admitted defeat in the face of visibility that wouldn't challenge a mole. You can hear them occasionally, engines rumbling somewhere in the fog, like lost whales calling for their pods, but actually seeing one, let alone catching one, has become about as likely as spotting a unicorn doing ballet. When buses do attempt to operate, they crawl along at speeds that make snails look like race cars. Drivers lean forward in their seats, squinting through windshields that might as well be painted gray, while conductors jump off to walk ahead and guide their vehicles like automotive seeing eye dogs. The few brave souls who attempt this automotive choreography quickly discover that navigating London's notoriously complex street layout requires actually being able to see the streets, a luxury the fog has decided to revoke without notice. Private cars have fared no better in this atmospheric apocalypse. Parking lots across the city have become graveyards of abandoned vehicles whose drivers gave up the impossible task of navigating roads they couldn't see. Car headlights, those beacons of automotive confidence, now illuminate approximately 3 feet of nothingness before giving up and reflecting back into their own bulbs. It's like trying to read a book with a flashlight that only shows you one letter at a time, except the book is London, and getting it wrong might kill you. The really ambitious drivers who refuse to surrender to the fog have created traffic patterns that would puzzle a chaos mathematician. Cars inch forward in long, blind processions, following taillights that appear and disappear like red fireflies in the murky darkness. These automotive conga lines move so slowly that pedestrians remember them. The people struggling to walk are actually making better time. There's something beautifully ironic about the machine age, being defeated by air so thick you could practically chew it. Aviation has simply given up and gone home to cry. Heathrow, that bustling hub of international travel, has become the world's most expensive parking lot. Planes that were supposed to land in London are being diverted to airports hundreds of miles away, their passengers probably wondering if they've accidentally traveled to an alternate dimension where London has been replaced by a cloud factory. The few aircraft that attempted landings quickly discovered that runways are surprisingly hard to find when you can't see them until you're already touching concrete. Even more amusing are the pilots who tried to take off only to realize that flying blind is considerably less romantic when you're responsible for a plane full of passengers, and the visibility extends to roughly the length of a cricket pitch. Air traffic control has evolved from a sophisticated science into something resembling a seance, with controllers trying to communicate with aircraft they can't see, directing them toward runways that exist more in theory than in practice. The railway system, normally the backbone of British transport, has discovered that fog doesn't respect the careful engineering that keeps trains on tracks. While the underground continues operating more on that blessed relief in a moment's surface, rail services have ground to a halt with the efficiency of a bureaucracy discovering new forms to fill out. Signal lights that were designed to be visible from impressive distances now disappear into the murk like will-o'-the-wisps, leaving train operators to navigate by faith, hope, and an alarming amount of guesswork. Freight transport has created its own special category of chaos. Delivery trucks loaded with goods for London's shops and businesses are scattered across the country like pieces from a board game thrown by an angry child. Drivers who left other cities bound for London have pulled over in confusion, unsure whether they've reached their destination or accidentally entered some automotive purgatory where roads exist, but destinations have been temporarily canceled by atmospheric management. The Thames, that liquid highway that has carried London's commerce for centuries, has become equally treacherous. Tugboat captains, who normally navigate by sight, now move like blind men in a room full of furniture, their vessels creeping along at speeds that make glacier movement look rapid. The fog has transformed London's river into a waterway where hitting another boat has become less a matter of if than when turning navigation into a game of extremely dangerous bumper cars played with multi-ton vessels. Historians still argue whether London had ever experienced such complete transportation paralysis. But standing here in the middle of this urban standstill, you're less concerned with historical precedent than with the growing realization that if you want to go anywhere, you're going to have to walk there, and walking has become an adventure sport, requiring equipment you don't own and skills you never learned. The London Underground has suddenly become the most popular destination in human history, though not because anyone particularly wants to be there. It's more like the underground has transformed into Noah's Ark for urban transportation, the last functioning refuge in a city where every other form of movement has been smothered by atmospheric malice. You're about to discover that cramming 8 million desperate people into a tunnel system designed for considerably fewer creates its own special brand of civilized chaos. The entrance to your local tube station has become a pilgrimage site where fog-weary Londoners gather like refugees fleeing an invisible disaster. The stairway descending into the underground represents the only reliable portal between where you are and where you need to be, assuming you can figure out where you actually are in the first place. Finding the station entrance requires the same navigation skills you've been developing for surface travel, except now the stakes are higher because missing it means remaining stranded in the atmospheric soup above. Descending into the underground feels like entering a parallel universe where the laws of physics still function properly. The moment you step below street level, the fog's grip loosens, replaced by the familiar industrial warmth and electric scented air of London's subterranean circulatory system. It's like diving underwater to escape a storm, except the storm is made of toxic air, and the water is a century-old tunnel system that suddenly seems as precious as oxygen. The ticket queues stretch back farther than anyone has ever seen, creating human rivers that flow through the station concourses, like dense, slow-moving tributaries of desperation. Everyone who would normally take buses, drive cars, walk short distances, or use any other form of transportation has been funneled into this underground bottleneck. The result is crowds that would impress a rock concert, except instead of music, everyone's united by the shared goal of reaching destinations they can't see from destinations they can barely remember. Platform conditions have evolved beyond crowded into something approaching a humanitarian logistics challenge. Trains arrive already packed with passengers from previous stations, only to discover platforms loaded with people who've been waiting for what feels like geological ages. The usual British politeness around queuing has been stress tested to its absolute limits, though somehow it's mostly holding up. There's something beautifully stubborn about maintaining proper queue etiquette during an atmospheric apocalypse. The underground staff have become heroes by default, transformed overnight from routine transit workers into guides for the lost and confused. Station attendants, who normally check tickets and make announcements, are now providing directions to people who literally don't know which end of London they're in. These employees have become impromptu city navigators, helping fog-blinded passengers figure out which station might get them closest to their invisible destinations. Train carriages designed for normal capacity are being tested by passenger loads that would challenge a physics textbook. Everyone who boards carries the distinctive eau de fog cologne, that delightful blend of sulfur soot and industrial despair that clings to clothing and hair like a toxic perfume. The air in the carriages becomes a mixture of underground mustiness and surface pollution, creating an atmospheric cocktail that tastes like civilization having a nervous breakdown. The journey times between stations haven't changed, but the psychological experience has been completely transformed. Each stop represents a potential escape route back to the surface fog, though many passengers are choosing to ride longer than necessary rather than face the atmospheric nightmare above. Some people are treating the underground like a mobile shelter, riding back and forth between stations while they work up the courage to attempt surface navigation again. What's particularly fascinating is how the fog has created temporary communities among strangers. Passengers share information about surface conditions at different stations, creating an informal intelligence network about which areas might be slightly less impossible to navigate. Victoria's completely impossible, someone reports, while another passenger offers, "I heard Baker Street might be clearing up," though these rumors prove about as reliable as weather forecasts during a hurricane. The underground map, normally a masterpiece of design clarity, has become a crucial survival document. Passengers study it with the intensity of military strategists planning complex operations, trying to determine which combination of lines might deposit them closest to their fog-shrouded destinations. Distance calculations that once seemed simple now require considering whether you can actually find your way from the station exit to your final destination through the atmospheric obstacle course above. Station announcements have taken on an almost biblical quality, voices echoing through tunnels filled with people seeking salvation from the toxic air above. Mind the Gap has never felt more relevant, though now it applies as much to the gap between underground safety and surface danger as to the space between train and platform. Historians still argue whether the Underground's design had anticipated serving as London's primary lifeline during such atmospheric emergencies. But right now, you're just grateful that Victorian engineers had the foresight to build a transportation system that operates independently of things like visibility and breathable air. The fog may have conquered the surface, but down here in these tunnels, civilization continues to function with the stubborn efficiency that built an empire. The fog has inadvertently created London's most successful crime wave, turning the entire city into a massive atmospheric getaway vehicle that never runs out of fuel. Every street has become a perfect crime scene where witnesses can't see police, can't pursue, and criminals can vanish simply by taking 3 steps in any direction. You're living through what might be history's most polite crime spree, conducted with typical British restraint, but unprecedented atmospheric assistance. Pickpockets have discovered that their profession has suddenly evolved from skilled craft to almost embarrassingly easy opportunism. In normal circumstances, a good pickpocket needs quick fingers, sharp eyes, and careful timing. Today, they barely need to be conscious. Victims bump into criminals in the fog, apologize politely for the collision, and continue on their way without realizing their wallets have just changed owners. It's like watching professional magicians perform tricks where the audience is blindfolded and the magic consists of simply reaching into people's pockets. The fog provides perfect cover for what polite society calls smash and grab operations, though in current conditions, it's more like stumble and snatch. Shop windows that would normally offer clear views of criminal activity now hide everything beyond arm's length. Thieves can break windows, clear out displays, and disappear into the murk before shopkeepers even realize they've been robbed. Some store owners don't discover the theft until hours later when they finally venture outside and find their front windows missing, along with everything that used to be behind them. Muggings have taken on an almost surreal quality in these conditions. Criminals emerge from the fog like atmospheric ghosts, commit their crimes, and fade back into invisibility with the efficiency of supernatural beings. Victims find themselves robbed by people they never clearly saw, creating police reports that read like encounters with urban legends. A voice in the fog demanded my purse, officer, and then the fog took my purse away. It sounds like the opening line of a ghost story, but it's become London's new normal. The police response to this crime wave demonstrates the fine British tradition of maintaining order even when order has become physically impossible. Officers patrol beats. They can't see investigating crimes. They can't observe and pursuing suspects who disappear the moment they step away from arm's reach. Police constables have been reduced to feeling their way along familiar routes, like blind watchmen their effectiveness limited to whatever crimes happen to occur within touching distance. What's particularly entertaining is watching police officers attempt to give chase in conditions where running in a straight line requires the navigation skills of a polar explorer. Criminals who would normally be caught within a block can now escape simply by changing direction unexpectedly, leaving officers stumbling through the fog while calling out warnings to people who might or might not be there. It's like playing tag in a room where someone turned off all the lights and filled the air with industrial strength smoke. The fog has also created opportunities for crimes that wouldn't exist under normal atmospheric conditions. Confidence tricksters are having field days with victims who can't verify what they're being told because they can't see what they're being shown. Just sign here, sir, for the evacuation becomes a surprisingly effective way to separate people from their money when nobody can read the documents they're signing or see the credentials of the people asking them to sign. Property crimes have evolved their own fog-specific techniques. Burglars no longer need to worry about being seen by neighbors' witnesses or even their victims in many cases. Houses that would normally be protected by visibility and social observation have become isolated islands where criminal activity can proceed without oversight. Some thieves are reportedly walking into homes through front doors conducting leisurely robberies and leaving through the same doors without anyone noticing until the fog clears days later. The criminal justice system has discovered that eyewitness testimony becomes meaningless when eyewitnesses can't see beyond their own noses. Court cases that depend on visual identification are being postponed indefinitely since I saw the defendant clearly has been replaced with I heard someone who might have been the defendant doing something I couldn't see in a fog so thick I couldn't tell if it was actually happening. Traffic-related crimes have become particularly creative, though calling them traffic-related might be generous when traffic itself has essentially ceased to exist. Vehicle theft has become less about hot wiring cars and more about finding cars whose owners have abandoned them in the fog. Some criminals are reportedly just sitting in random vehicles until their owners return, then claiming they thought it was their own car, an excuse that's surprisingly plausible when visibility extends to approximately the length of a car door handle. Historians still argue whether the fog of 1952 represented London's peak crime period, but the statistics are unreliable since many crimes went unreported simply because victims couldn't find police stations and police couldn't find crime scenes. The fog has created a temporary suspension of normal law enforcement that would be terrifying if it weren't so absurdly British in its execution. What's most remarkable is how even criminal activity maintains a certain politeness in these conditions, with many reported robberies, including apologies for the inconvenience and directions to the nearest underground station. Normal life has officially filed for divorce from December 1952, London citing irreconcilable differences with atmospheric visibility. Every institution that keeps society functioning, schools, offices, theaters, shops, has discovered that their carefully planned operations depend rather heavily on people being able to see where they're going and what they're doing. You're witnessing the systematic shutdown of civilization, one fog-defeated activity at a time, as London transforms from a bustling metropolis into a city-sized sensory deprivation experiment. Schools have become the first casualties of the fog's war on education. Teachers attempting to conduct lessons discover that taking attendance requires actually being able to see their students, a skill that's become surprisingly challenging when visibility hovers around the length of a ruler. Children who manage to navigate their way to school through the atmospheric maze often arrive so covered in soot and so exhausted from the journey that they look like tiny chimney sweeps reporting for duty rather than pupils ready for arithmetic lessons. The few schools that attempt to remain open quickly realize that playground supervision has evolved from watching children play to conducting search and rescue operations for children who wander 3 feet from the building and vanish into the gray-green void. Recess becomes less about recreation and more about preventing small humans from disappearing entirely into London's new toxic atmosphere. Teachers find themselves tying ropes around students like mountain climbers, which would be adorable if it weren't so necessary for basic survival. Office buildings across the city are experiencing their own fog-related existential crisis. Workers who manage the heroic journey to their desks discover that conducting business becomes challenging when clients can't find the building deliveries, can't locate addresses, and telephone lines carry more conversations about people being lost in fog than actual business transactions. Secretaries spend their days providing directions to callers who sound increasingly desperate. "I think I'm near your building, but I can't see it. Can you describe what it looks like from inside the fog?" The retail sector has embraced what might charitably be called atmospheric markdown madness. Shop owners who can't see potential customers until they're literally touching the storefront have given up on normal sales techniques. Window displays become meaningless when windows are invisible, and browsing requires customers to feel their way along merchandise, like blind people reading retail braille. Some enterprising shopkeepers have started calling out their wares into the fog like medieval town criers, creating an audio marketplace where products are sold by description rather than demonstration. Restaurants have discovered that dining becomes an adventure sport when customers can't see their food, waiters can't see their customers, and the kitchen can't see whether anyone's actually eating what they're preparing. The fog seeping through doors and windows has created dining atmospheres that would challenge a cave exploration team. Some establishments have simply given up on table service and started ladling soup into whatever containers people bring, treating their restaurants like fog refuges rather than culinary destinations. London's famous theater district has experienced its own dramatic collapse, though not in the artistic sense. Several performances have been canceled when fog infiltrated auditoriums through doors, windows, and what seemed like the very walls themselves. Audiences who can't see the stage struggle to appreciate dramatic performances, while actors who can't see each other or the audience find themselves performing essentially for their own entertainment. One particularly determined theater reportedly continued a performance where the actors had to call out their positions to each other, like actors playing blind man's bluff, which accidentally became more entertaining than the original play. Sports venues have surrendered entirely to atmospheric impossibility. Football matches where players can't see the ball, the goal, or each other have been postponed until further notice. Cricket, that most British of sports has been defeated by weather conditions that make the traditional complaint about rain delays seem charmingly quaint. Spectators who paid to watch sporting events instead find themselves listening to confused commentary about games that might or might not be happening somewhere in the fog-shrouded distance. Public services have adapted with the characteristic British determination to maintain bureaucracy even during atmospheric apocalypse. Post offices continue operating, though mail delivery has become an exercise in faith-based navigation where postal workers attempt to find addresses they can't see on streets they can't identify. Some mail is reportedly being delivered to whatever building the postman encounters, first creating a lottery system where correspondence reaches randomly selected neighbors instead of intended recipients. Libraries have become unexpected social centers as people seek refuge from the fog in buildings they can actually locate and navigate once inside. Librarians report unusual increases in attendance, though patrons seem more interested in sitting somewhere with clean air and electric lighting than in actually reading books. The fog has accidentally created London's most popular social clubs, where membership requires only the ability to find the entrance through atmospheric soup. Medical facilities face their own fog-specific challenges. Doctors attempting house calls discover that finding patients' homes requires navigation skills that would challenge a professional explorer, while patients trying to reach hospitals often give up halfway through journeys that become more like expeditions through hostile territory than simple medical appointments. Historians still argue whether any modern city had ever experienced such complete suspension of normal activities, but you're too busy trying to figure out how to buy groceries when you can't find the grocery store to worry about historical precedents. The fog has revealed its true nature as a silent assassin, one that doesn't need weapons or dramatic confrontations to claim its victims. Instead, it simply asks you to breathe, and breathing, that most automatic, thoughtless human activity, has become a slow-motion method of poisoning yourself with every inhalation. You're beginning to understand that this atmospheric monster isn't just inconvenient or dangerous. It's genuinely lethal, and it's selecting its victims with the calculated efficiency of a predator that has all the time in the world. Your throat has been scratchy since yesterday, but today it feels like you've been gargling with sandpaper soaked in industrial solvent. Each breath carries a burning sensation that starts in your nose, travels down your throat, and settles in your chest like hot coals. The air that once sustained life has become an active participant in damaging it, turning your respiratory system into a battlefield where oxygen comes mixed with poison, and every breath requires a conscious decision to continue living. The coughing started as an occasional irritation, but has evolved into a constant symphony of respiratory distress echoing from every building, every street corner, every gathering of fog-trapped Londoners. It's not the productive cough of a cold or the dry hack of winter air. This is something deeper, more persistent, a wet, rattling sound that suggests your lungs are trying to expel something they were never designed to process. Children's coughs sound particularly heartbreaking, their small respiratory systems struggling against pollution loads that would challenge a coal miner. You notice that breathing itself requires more effort now, as if the air has become thicker, more resistant to entering your lungs. What used to be an automatic process now demands conscious attention. You find yourself taking deliberate measured breaths, trying to extract oxygen from an atmosphere that seems increasingly reluctant to provide it. It's like trying to breathe underwater, except the water is made of industrial waste and Victorian era environmental policy. The elderly and the already sick are bearing the worst of the fog's assault. Mrs. Henderson, next door, who was merely frail yesterday, hasn't been heard from since this morning. The silence from her flat is more ominous than her usual coughing, because at least coughing meant she was still fighting. Across the city, hospitals are quietly filling with patients whose conditions have nothing to do with traditional illnesses and everything to do with trying to survive in air that's become hostile to human life. What makes this particularly insidious is how gradual the deterioration feels. You don't suddenly collapse from fog poisoning. Instead, you slowly weaken as your body struggles to function with compromised air quality. Energy levels drop without obvious cause, thinking becomes slightly more difficult, and simple activities leave you breathless in ways that feel wrong, but not dramatic enough to inspire panic. It's death by 1,000 tiny cuts, each breath adding another microscopic injury that accumulates into something genuinely dangerous. The fog's victim selection process follows its own cruel logic. The very young and very old suffer first, their respiratory systems, less equipped to handle the toxic cocktail floating at breathing level. People with existing heart or lung conditions find their bodies unable to compensate for the additional stress of processing poisoned air. Even healthy adults begin experiencing symptoms that range from annoying to alarming headaches that won't respond to aspirin dizziness that strikes without warning, and a general sense of physical malaise that feels like being slowly poisoned, which is essentially what's happening. Medical professionals are struggling with conditions they've never encountered in such concentrations. Doctors report treating patients for symptoms that read like industrial poisoning cases, severe respiratory distress, carbon monoxide exposure, and chemical burns to lung tissue from breathing air that's become more toxic waste than atmosphere. Emergency rooms are filling with people whose primary complaint is simply that breathing hurts, which should be absurd but has become London's new medical reality. The psychological impact compounds the physical damage. Realizing that the air around you, the most basic requirement for survival, has become dangerous, creates a special kind of anxiety that affects decision-making and stress levels. People are developing what might be called atmospheric paranoia, constantly evaluating whether their next breath might be more harmful than helpful. It's impossible to hold your breath indefinitely, but breathing feels like a betrayal of your own survival instincts. Historians still argue whether the immediate death toll could have been predicted based on pollution levels, but standing here in the middle of this toxic cloud, you're less concerned with retrospective analysis than with the growing realization that your city's air has become genuinely lethal. The fog isn't just hiding London, it's slowly killing it one breath at a time with the patience of a predator that knows its prey can't escape. What's most terrifying is how normal this abnormality is beginning to feel. Your body is adapting to breathing poison. Your mind is accepting atmospheric toxicity as a temporary inconvenience, and London continues functioning despite slowly suffocating itself. It's like watching a city commit atmospheric suicide in slow motion while maintaining perfect British composure throughout the process. The fog has transformed breathing from life's most basic pleasure into its most dangerous necessity. The morning of December 10th arrives with something London hasn't seen in 5 days: the possibility of hope. You wake to find that the gray-green monster that has been slowly strangling your city is finally showing signs of weakness, retreating like a defeated army that has run out of ammunition. The weather patterns that created this atmospheric nightmare are shifting, and Mother Nature, apparently tired of her toxic chemistry experiment, has decided to restore normal atmospheric service to 8 million grateful Londoners. The first sign of liberation comes as a gradual lightening of the oppressive darkness that has defined your world for nearly a week. What began as merely less impossible visibility slowly evolves into something approaching actual sight. Street lamps that have been burning continuously for days start to seem unnecessary as genuine daylight begins penetrating the toxic blanket. It's like watching the world's slowest sunrise, except instead of night giving way to day, it's poison giving way to something resembling breathable air. You venture outside to witness London's resurrection from atmospheric death. Buildings that vanished 5 days ago are materializing like developing photographs, their familiar facades emerging from the retreating fog with the magical quality of lost friends returning from a very long, very dangerous journey. The city you thought you knew is revealing itself again, street by street, landmark by landmark, as if someone is slowly adjusting the contrast settings on reality itself. The fog's retreat creates its own strange geography as pockets of clear air mix with lingering toxic clouds. Some streets emerge completely, while others remain partially shrouded, creating a patchwork cityscape where visibility changes dramatically from block to block. It's like watching London return to life in sections, a gradual resurrection that reveals both the damage and the remarkable resilience of urban civilization under atmospheric assault. Transportation begins its awkward return to functionality with the enthusiasm of a rusty machine being coaxed back to life. Buses emerge from depot hiding places like cautious animals testing whether it's safe to venture into the world again. Their drivers' heroes who have spent 5 days in involuntary retirement approach their routes with the careful optimism of people who still can't quite believe the atmospheric siege has lifted. The first bus you see moving at normal speed feels like witnessing a miracle of mechanical resurrection. The psychological impact of seeing beyond arm's length again creates an almost euphoric response among fog survivors. People stand in the streets, pointing at buildings they can actually see, calling out to neighbors they can finally locate, and celebrating the simple pleasure of walking without needing navigation equipment. There's something beautifully childlike about adults expressing genuine joy at being able to see lampposts and read street signs activities that were mundane a week ago, but now feel like recovering lost superpowers. However, the fog's retreat also reveals the extent of the damage it inflicted during its 5-day occupation of London. Streets are littered with abandoned vehicles whose drivers gave up the impossible task of navigation days ago. Shop windows remain broken from fog-enabled crime sprees, and the general appearance of the city suggests it has been through some kind of atmospheric war, which isn't far from the truth. The human cost becomes clearer as hospitals report the true extent of respiratory casualties. The fog didn't just inconvenience London, it systematically poisoned its population with death tolls that won't be fully calculated for months. The elderly, the young, and the already sick paid the highest price for this atmospheric disaster, their lives claimed by air that became more toxic than beneficial. Conservative estimates suggest at least 4,000 deaths directly attributable to 5 days of breathing what could charitably be called air, but more accurately described as industrial waste. This environmental catastrophe becomes a catalyst for genuine political change with the efficiency that only dramatic disasters can achieve. The Clean Air Act of 1956 emerges directly from the fog's legacy legislation that would never have passed without the visceral experience of an entire city nearly suffocating itself with its own pollution. Politicians who lived through these 5 days of atmospheric hell suddenly discover environmental enthusiasm they never knew they possessed. The fog's lesson proves, both immediate and lasting, London's industrial progress had been slowly killing its inhabitants, but the killing was so gradual that nobody noticed until it became concentrated into 5 days of visible, smellable, undeniable toxicity. The 1952 smog served as a dramatic preview of what slow environmental poisoning looks like when compressed into a timeline short enough for humans to actually perceive cause and effect. Historians still argue whether the Great Smog represented a turning point in environmental awareness or merely a dramatic symptom of problems that would have been addressed eventually through less catastrophic means. But as you stand here breathing air that doesn't burn your throat, watching London return to life after its brush with atmospheric death, the academic debates feel less important than the simple pleasure of inhaling without pain. The fog taught London that progress without environmental consideration isn't progress at all. It's just delayed suicide with better marketing. This lesson learned through 5 days of collective near suffocation would influence British environmental policy for decades to come, proving that sometimes the most effective teacher is a disaster dramatic enough to be impossible to ignore. The city's air quality improved dramatically in the following years, though London's relationship with atmospheric pollution remained complicated. The visible odorous pollutants that created the 1952 smog were largely eliminated, but subtler forms of air pollution continued claiming lives with the quiet efficiency of invisible killers. Modern London still struggles with air quality issues that kill thousands annually, but these deaths lack the dramatic concentration that made the Great Smog impossible to ignore. As the last wisps of toxic fog drift away from your neighborhood, you realize you've survived something that will be remembered as one of environmental history's most dramatic lessons. The air feels clean, the visibility extends beyond your fingertips, and London begins the slow process of returning to normal, whatever normal means, for a city that just spent 5 days learning how to die from its own atmosphere. But the fog's legacy lingers in ways that extend far beyond respiratory medicine and environmental legislation. It demonstrated that modern cities could create atmospheric conditions capable of killing their own inhabitants, and that environmental protection isn't just about saving distant wilderness areas. It's about ensuring that the air in your own neighborhood doesn't become actively hostile to human survival. The Great Smog of 1952 proved that civilization's greatest threat might not come from external enemies or natural disasters, but from the accumulated consequences of our own industrial ambitions when they're allowed to operate without considering whether breathing their byproducts might be fundamentally incompatible with staying alive. As you take your first truly deep breath in nearly a week tasting air that doesn't carry the flavor of industrial apocalypse, you understand that you've witnessed London's atmospheric rock bottom and hopefully its environmental awakening. The fog that nearly killed a city became the disaster that taught a nation to consider whether progress and poison needed to be synonymous, or whether perhaps clean air might be worth preserving, even if it meant rethinking how 8 million people heat their homes and power their industries. The morning breeze carries away the last traces of London's toxic fog, leaving behind cleaner air, a traumatized population, and the hard-won knowledge that some forms of progress can literally take your breath away permanently. In the gentle wind that finally disperses the Great Smog, you can almost hear the whisper of environmental policies being born the quiet promise that London will never again allow its own atmosphere to become a weapon against its inhabitants. And in that promise, as fragile and tentative as it might be, lies the hope that this atmospheric nightmare might be remembered not just as a disaster, but as the shock that taught a city to value the simple, life-sustaining miracle of air that doesn't burn when you breathe it. The fog lifts, the city breathes again, and somewhere in the distant future, children will grow up in London without ever knowing what it feels like to be slowly poisoned by their own sky. Sweet dreams, dear listeners. May your air always be clear, your breathing easy, and your cities wise enough to learn from London's atmospheric awakening before needing to repeat its suffocating lessons.